The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the dusty street of a small southern town. The air was thick with the quiet hum of evening, the kind of stillness that made every step seem louder than it should be. John walked alone, his boots crunching softly against the dry ground. His face, marked by the wear of life, was stoic, yet there was an undeniable weight in his steps. He was just another black man in a town where that fact meant something, a lot of something. As he moved forward, his eyes flicked to the side, where a woman stood by the porch of a weathered house. Her hair was neatly styled, her dress pressed, the epitome of what the town deemed proper. Mary. She was young, her face pale, her eyes wide and innocent, or at least they appeared that way. Their gazes locked for a brief second. Just one moment, fleeting and unremarkable to anyone who might have looked. But to John it was like the world paused for just a breath. His heart skipped a beat, an inexplicable feeling, a mix of discomfort and curiosity. He quickly turned his head and kept walking, trying to shake the tension that clung to him. What did I do? What did I even do wrong? Just looked? His thoughts echoed in his mind. He tried to push it away, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave. He knew he shouldn't have felt that way, but it was like the weight of being watched, judged, was already upon him. He kept walking, his pace quickening. He was just a man passing through, just trying to get home. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that this one moment, this one innocent glance, would change everything. As he walked, the setting sun bathed the town in a soft orange glow, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should have. The town, quiet and still, was holding its breath. And so was he, unaware that what lay ahead would be far worse than he could ever imagine. The next morning, John stepped out of his small home, stretching his arms and yawning. The sun was already high, a bright reminder that the day had begun, though the unease from yesterday still lingered in his chest. His thoughts kept returning to that fleeting moment, Mary's face, the tension in the air, but he had to push it away. Life went on, and he had work to do. He walked the same path he had taken 1,000 times, but today felt different, like the ground beneath his feet wasn't steady. His steps were deliberate, but his mind raced with questions. What had he done wrong? Why had he felt that strange weight yesterday? Could it be that the small townspeople were watching him more than usual? John shook his head, trying to rid himself of the thoughts, but they kept circling. Suddenly, a sharp sound broke his concentration, a car engine revving loudly in the distance. He didn't see it at first, but soon it was right behind him. Before he could react, the car screeched to a halt and the door slammed open. From behind the wheel, the sheriff stepped out, flanked by 2 men who looked more like trouble than officers. They were gruff, their faces hard, their eyes cold. John froze. His stomach sank. The uneasy feeling from the day before intensified. He felt the weight of their gaze as they approached, the oppressive silence thick between them. "What did I do wrong?" John asked, his voice shaky as he took a step back. His heart pounded. "And?" The sheriff's lips curled into a tight, cruel smile. He was an older man, weathered by years of authority. His voice was a low growl, full of disdain. "You'll learn, boy," the sheriff said, stepping closer. "You don't look at white women like that around here. You understand me?" John stood still, confused and terrified. He opened his mouth to speak, to tell them that he hadn't done anything, but the words caught in his throat. The sheriff didn't care. The accusation had already been made. "I didn't do anything, I swear," John blurted out, his hands shaking as he stepped back, trying to make sense of it all. "I was just walking. You'll save it for the judge," the sheriff interrupted, his tone final. "You're under arrest." Before John could even register what was happening, one of the men grabbed him roughly by the arm, dragging him toward the police car. The other man walked ahead, a smirk crossing his face as they all marched in a tight line, John stumbling along. Fear surged through John's veins as he was thrown into the back seat of the car with a hard thud. The doors slammed shut, and the car roared to life. He felt the vibrations of the engine beneath him, but it did little to calm his racing heart. The town was still asleep, most of the windows dark, but John could sense the eyes on him, hidden behind curtains. It was as though the whole town had been waiting for this moment. John turned his head and saw the familiar faces peeking from behind windows. Some seemed curious, others concerned, but no one dared to intervene. Not one person stepped forward to ask what was happening, to challenge the sheriff. A small part of him wanted to scream, to shout that he was innocent, but he knew it would fall on deaf ears. The weight of being black in this town, of being seen as less than human, made it clear that the truth didn't matter here. The car bumped over uneven roads as it made its way to the jail. John couldn't stop his mind from racing, replaying the events in his head. One simple look, one innocent glance, and this was what it had come to. He couldn't understand how something so small, so meaningless to him, could be twisted into something so dangerous. And yet it was happening. He was being dragged away as though he were a criminal, as though his existence was a crime in itself. John leaned back against the cold metal of the car seat, his mind reeling. He wasn't sure whether to feel more angry or scared. Both emotions collided inside him, fighting for dominance. What could he do? How could he fight against this injustice when no one would believe him? John sat in the cold, stark courtroom, his hands trembling as he clutched the sides of the chair. The air was thick with tension, the room full of people whispering, eyes flicking back and forth between him and the prosecutor. The floor creaked beneath the feet of the few people who dared to look at him directly, but most kept their gaze low. It was as though his very presence was an affront to everything this town stood for. He had hoped for a fair trial, some glimpse of justice, but the moment he walked into that courtroom, he knew it was a lie. The jury, a group of 12 white men, sat motionless in their seats, their eyes hard and unblinking. None of them seemed interested in the facts, in the truth. No, their minds had already been made up. They had already decided who the guilty party was, and it wasn't going to be anyone they looked like. The judge, a man who had likely been sitting on the bench longer than John had been alive, barely seemed to register his existence. His disinterested eyes flicked between papers on his desk as if this were nothing more than a nuisance, a small problem to resolve before he could get back to whatever it was he cared about. The prosecutor, a slick-haired man in a tailored suit, was the only one who seemed fully awake, fully engaged in the task at hand. His voice rang out with confidence, clear and cold, as he called for John's conviction. "The word of a lady," the prosecutor said with an almost mocking smile. "That's all the evidence we need. The defendant doesn't need a fair trial. What we have here is a clear case. Guilty." John's defense lawyer, a man with a face full of weariness, stood up slowly, as though he too had already given up on any chance of winning. "You have no evidence." The defense lawyer's voice was weak, hoarse. "There is no proof, no corroborating witness. This is not a case of justice. This is—" The prosecutor interrupted, his voice rising, cutting through the defense's arguments like a blade. "Evidence is not needed when we have the word of a lady." His voice boomed across the room, sending an electric charge of unease through John's chest. It wasn't just the words that stung, but the certainty with which they were spoken. There was no room for debate, no room for facts. John's heart hammered in his chest, and the world around him felt like it was closing in. The sounds of the courtroom faded into a muffled buzz. He wasn't listening to the back and forth anymore. He was trapped in his own thoughts, each one a hammering beat in his skull. The trial, the lies, the accusations, they were all crashing together, blurring into one overwhelming sensation of hopelessness. This isn't a trial, John thought bitterly, his hands clenched into fists on his lap. This is a death sentence. The words echoed in his mind, and he couldn't shake them. He wasn't here for justice. He wasn't here for the truth. This trial was just a formality, a show of power to prove that nothing had changed, that a black man could still be convicted on nothing but the flimsiest of accusations, and no one would bat an eye. As the prosecutor continued with his impassioned speech, John's eyes flickered over to the jury. The 12 men sat unmoved, their faces like stone, each one more uninterested than the last. Their eyes were all cold, their expressions void of empathy. They looked at John like he wasn't even a person, just an object to be disposed of. John's mind raced, but there was nothing he could do. Every word that came from the prosecutor's mouth felt like a weight pressing down on him. The damning accusation, the absence of proof, his own defense crumbling under the weight of the room's disinterest. The judge, finally lifting his eyes from the paperwork, gave the jury a solemn nod. "We'll now proceed to the verdict." The silence in the room was deafening, so quiet that John could hear the rapid beating of his own heart. The world seemed to move in slow motion as the jury filed in, the camera lingering on their hard, indifferent faces. No expressions of doubt, no hesitation, just faces set in stone, waiting to deliver their verdict. John's stomach twisted as the foreman stood up, holding the paper with the decision. The words on the page felt like they were being burned into his brain. There was no question in his mind now. He had already lost. "Guilty," the foreman's voice rang out, and in that one word everything that John had feared was confirmed. His entire body went cold. His chest tightened, as though the air had been sucked out of the room. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. He stared ahead, his eyes wide, but no words came out. He didn't even know if he could speak anymore. The camera lingered on his face, capturing the terror in his eyes, the disbelief. His body stiffened, frozen in place. The realization had hit him hard, but still, it didn't seem real. The world around him continued, but for John, time stopped. The courthouse doors slammed shut behind John as he was hastily escorted by a group of armed officers. His body was numb, and the weight of his conviction settled heavily upon him. There was no relief in sight, no hope that justice would be served. His trial had been a farce, a mockery of the very idea of law and fairness. Now all he could do was walk into the unknown, shackled and trapped in a nightmare. The air outside was thick with heat, the sky a harsh, unforgiving blue. As they stepped down the courthouse steps, John could hear the distant roar of voices. The crowd was already waiting for him. The mob. They were everywhere. John's heart pounded in his chest as he was pushed forward. The officers' hands were firm on his arms, but even they couldn't stop the mob from surging closer. A wave of hatred, of rage, swept over him. His head was spinning and his stomach twisted in knots. The faces around him were a blur, angry, hateful faces. Some sneered, others laughed, but all were eager for the violence to come. They didn't care that he was a man. They didn't care that he was innocent. He could feel the eyes on him, could almost hear the thoughts of the people around him. "This is how it's always been, boy. You thought you were safe? You thought you could look at her and get away with it?" The words weren't spoken aloud, but they echoed in his mind, reverberating like a sickening drumbeat. John tried to move, tried to escape, but the hands of the officers gripped him tighter, pulling him through the crowd. The screams grew louder, the chants more vicious. His chest constricted, and his breath became shallow. He was suffocating, drowning in the venom that surrounded him. His mind raced, the words of his defense lawyer still fresh in his ears. "This isn't a trial. This is a death sentence." He had hoped it would be over after the verdict, but it wasn't over. It was only just beginning. As he was dragged through the sea of people, John's gaze caught a glimpse of the leader of the mob. The man stood tall, his face twisted into an expression of pure malice. He stepped forward, his voice booming above the chants, his words slicing through the air like a sharp blade. "No man like you will ever walk free again." The mob leader spat, his voice dripping with venom. John's knees buckled, his entire body shaking. His stomach churned. There was no escape. There was no hope. "Please," John begged, his voice breaking, raw with terror. "I'm innocent. Please don't—" His words fell on deaf ears. The mob had no interest in justice, no desire to hear the truth. All they wanted was their retribution, their power over someone they deemed less than human. They had already decided that his life meant nothing. John felt his feet being dragged across the dusty ground. He stumbled, his body weak from the ordeal, but it didn't matter. The mob continued to push him forward, their hands pulling him toward the tree that loomed in the distance. The camera followed John's face, capturing every flicker of emotion as he was brought to the place where he would meet his end. His eyes were wide with fear, his lips trembling as he tried to comprehend the horror unfolding before him. There was a surreal quality to the moment, as though time itself had slowed down. But no matter how much he wished to escape, there was no way out. The thick, weathered rope creaked as it was tied around his neck, a sound that seemed to echo through the world. The camera zoomed in on John's hands, bound and useless, his fingers twitching involuntarily. His heart raced, and the stares of the onlookers grew heavier with every passing second. The mob leader stood in front of him, his eyes cold and unfeeling. He reached out and tightened the rope, a cruel smile creeping across his face. "You're nothing," the mob leader said, his words cold and final, nothing but a lesson for anyone who thinks they can get away with it. John's breath hitched in his throat as the rope was pulled taut. His body went stiff, the fear flooding him like a tidal wave. The world around him seemed to blur as the reality of what was about to happen sank in. The crowd watched in silence, their faces emotionless. Some of them smiled, others stood in solemn indifference. It didn't matter to them that John was a person. They had already stripped him of his humanity. He was no longer a man. He was an object, a symbol of the power they wielded over the lives of others. As the camera pulled back, the tree came into full view. The thick rope hung loosely from the branches, swaying gently in the wind as John was positioned beneath it. His body was weak, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. His pleas had fallen on deaf ears, his cries for mercy swallowed by the crowd's bloodlust. With one final sickening motion, the rope tightened, and John was lifted from the ground. His body jerked, the air leaving his lungs in a frantic gasp. The world around him was spinning, fading into darkness. The suffocating weight of the rope, the harshness of his conviction, it was all too much. And then there was nothing. The camera lingered on the crowd's faces, some cheering, others indifferent, before pulling away to show the quiet, desolate town behind them, a place where injustice reigned, and the cries of the innocent were drowned out by the screams of the mob. The town, once bustling with activity, now felt like a hollow shell. The sun rose and set, indifferent to the tragedy that had unfolded just days earlier. Life, as it always did in small southern towns, moved on. People went about their daily routines, pretending not to notice the gaping hole left by John's death. The lynching had come and gone, and with it the sickening weight of injustice. Some people, though, couldn't shake the images, the twisted rope, the chants of the mob. Their hearts burned with the knowledge that John had been murdered in cold blood, a scapegoat for a crime he never committed. But their anger was tempered with a sense of helplessness, a realization that nothing would change. It never did. There were whispers, furtive conversations in dark corners and behind closed doors. They were hushed, but they were there. "She lied," a man muttered to his friend as they passed by the graveyard, their voices low and full of guilt. "We all know she lied." His friend looked over his shoulder, eyes darting around to make sure no one else was listening. "Don't speak that name here," the woman replied, shaking her head. "You'll get us all killed." It wasn't just fear, it was survival. The town had made its decision, and those who dared question it knew they would pay the price. It wasn't just John who had died. It was the truth itself, buried deep beneath the weight of the lies and the silence that followed. As the camera pans across the town, the streets are eerily quiet. No one speaks of John's death openly, and those who do are careful. There's a sense of inevitability in the air, a dark understanding that nothing could be done. The truth, much like the man it was meant to protect, had been buried. The camera lingers on a quiet graveyard on the edge of town. The wind rustles through the tall grass, and the sun casts long shadows across the unmarked graves. John's grave is among them, a simple mound of dirt, unnoticed by most, forgotten by all. There's no memorial, no recognition for the life that was stolen. Just another forgotten soul in a town too afraid to remember. In the distance, a figure approaches the grave, their silhouette blurred against the setting sun. It's too far to make out their face, but their posture says everything. Head bowed, shoulders heavy with the weight of unspoken sorrow. They stop at the grave, kneeling down as if paying their respects. A single tear falls, silently, before they stand and turn away, leaving the grave behind, just as the town had. Decades had passed and the town had moved on. Time had a way of dulling the edges of memories, turning them into distant echoes, barely audible in the cacophony of everyday life. But for all the years that had passed, there were still those who remembered, who still carried the weight of John's unjust death in their hearts. One afternoon, in the heart of a dusty, dimly lit archive, a young journalist stumbled upon something that would change everything. He had been scouring through old records, stories of the past, when he found the yellowed envelope. It was tucked away at the bottom of a forgotten box, so far removed from the light that it seemed to be begging to be found. The envelope was fragile, its edges worn from years of neglect. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper, handwritten, with words that would shatter the illusion of peace the town had built around itself. The journalist unfolded the paper slowly, and as his eyes scanned the words, the weight of what he was reading settled over him like a heavy fog. "I can't live with this guilt anymore," the letter began. The ink faded in places, but the message still clear. John was innocent. It was a lie. It was all a lie. My family, the town, they all pressured me. They told me what I had to say, what was expected of me. But I know now that I condemned an innocent man to death. The journalist's hands trembled as he read on. The words were like a punch to the gut. Mary's confession. The truth, buried for so many years, was finally being brought to light. "I never wanted this," the letter continued. "I was just a scared girl caught in a web of fear and societal expectations. I'm so sorry, John. I am so sorry." The words echoed in his mind. "I'm so sorry." Those words couldn't undo the damage, couldn't bring John back, couldn't undo the tragedy that had unfolded in the name of a lie. But they were the truth, raw and painful, and they exposed the heart of a history the town had tried so desperately to forget. The journalist sat back in his chair, stunned. His mind raced, trying to grasp the enormity of what he had uncovered. The truth had been buried for so long, hidden in plain sight, and now it was here, on this crumpled sheet of paper held in his hands like a fragile thread connecting the past to the present. He couldn't keep this to himself. He had to tell the world. The truth had to be known. But as he stood up, a voice from behind him stopped him cold. "Do you really think it matters now?" The voice was low, worn with age, but it was unmistakable. The journalist turned to see an elderly man standing in the doorway, his face weathered by time, his eyes tired but sharp. The journalist hesitated, his eyes still on the letter in his hand. This changes everything. We can finally tell the truth. People need to know." The elder shook his head slowly, a somber smile pulling at the corners of his lips. "You don't get it, do you, boy?" he said, his voice thick with years of pain. "What's done is done. The past is like a river. You can't go back and change the current once it's already flowed." "But we have the truth," the journalist protested, holding up the letter. We can fix this. We can make things right. The elder's gaze softened as he approached, taking a seat next to the journalist. He looked at the letter, then at the young man's eager face. "You're right. We've been living with this lie for far too long," he said quietly. "But the truth, it came too late." The elder leaned back, his gaze distant. "The town's moved on. The people who needed to hear the truth are gone, or they don't care anymore. The wounds were already too deep. For years, people have lived their lives, pretending it never happened, pretending John was just a ghost story, a name spoken only in whispers. But now all we can do is remember him. We'll never forget him." The journalist's hands tightened around the letter. His heart pounded, frustration rising within him. It's not too late, he thought. We can make them remember. But even as he thought it, a sense of futility began to creep in. The town had moved on, its history buried under layers of time, and no confession could undo the damage that had already been done. The truth was there, but it was like a ghost, faint, unreal, and haunting only those who were brave enough to face it. As the camera zooms out from the journalist's solemn face, we see the quiet town outside. Life still continued. The streets were the same. The old buildings stood, weathered by time but unmoved. And yet, everything had changed. Or maybe nothing had. The camera lingers on the empty streets, the wind sweeping through the silent town, and the elder's voice echoes, soft but resolute. The truth may never change what happened, but we'll carry it with us. We'll carry him with us. The final shot is of the letter, crumpled in the journalist's hand. The words may be out, but they can never undo the years of pain, fear, and injustice. The truth has been uncovered, but it is no longer a salve. It is a burden. The camera slowly pulls back, revealing the quiet town bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. The streets are empty now, the town eerily still. It's as if the land itself holds its breath, waiting. No words are spoken, only the weight of what has transpired hangs heavy in the air. The people have long since moved on, but the truth remains, a truth too long buried, now rising to the surface like an unhealed wound. The camera zooms in on the lone figure of John's unmarked grave, the earth worn and weathered, the name fading from the stone. The wind rustles the tall grass surrounding the grave, the only sound in an otherwise silent town. It's a simple grave, no grand marker or proclamation of his innocence. But in that moment, it speaks volumes. Emotion fills the scene, melancholy for the life that was stolen. But there is also a quiet empowerment. John's truth, though delayed, was never truly forgotten. It has lingered in the hearts of those brave enough to remember, in the whispers of those who knew better, and in the journal that unearthed the confession. John's story may have been buried, but it will never be erased. A soft voice begins, filling the silence, a final reflection that carries the weight of everything that has happened. His name was John, and his truth will never die. As the camera pans away from the grave, it captures the long shadows cast by the setting sun over the town. The sky above, though tinted with the colors of dusk, carries the heaviness of the past. The camera moves upward, showing the horizon where the light of the truth now begins to break, painting the world in the glow of an unsettling awareness. The injustice is laid bare, and though the town may continue to live on, things will never be the same. The legacy of what was done and what should have been lingers, pushing the town to confront its darker history, whether it wants to or not. But John's name, his truth, will stand as a quiet testament to the cruelty he endured, and as a reminder that the past, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of resurfacing when we least expect it. It will never die. His truth will live on in the hearts of those who refuse to forget. The camera lingers on the grave for a moment longer, and then, slowly, fades to black.